You are now listening to the Cult Cast.
All right, today we are tuning in to our second Cult Cast. We have Damien on the phone and we have Jay on the phone. These two human beings have created one of my favorite books this year and one of the most in-depth books I've ever seen on gang culture. Really focusing on Chicago gang culture and the history of this culture, and it goes into territories that I never even knew existed. The name of the book is Compliments of Chicagohoodz. Introduce yourself. Go for it.
My name is James O'Connor. I'm known as Jinx.
Corrado, a.k.a. Mr. C on the book.
All right. So, first question, what inspired you to create such an in-depth book on Chicago gang culture, and how did the name of the book come about as well?
Growing up in the western suburbs, I used to take the L train into downtown Chicago, and I'd like staring out the window and reading all the graffiti as it went by. And as the years went by, I noticed that that the graffiti stayed. The graffiti might have changed, but the names of the gangs were always the same in those particular neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So which led me to believe, or kind of made me a little familiar with some territories. The name Chicagohoodz is respect to that. It's in reference to the neighborhoods themselves and the gangs that had formed within those communities. The name of the book, Compliments of Chicagohoodz, is this book was actually originally supposed to be a promotional thing for the future book, which would be a more in-depth history. And this particular book was to focus on the compliment cards that you see throughout the pages of the book.
Okay.
Yeah, we both share a joint fascination with both the history and the aesthetics of Chicago street gangs, and so we came together and decided to do a history book on the Chicago gang culture from the Greaser era up into the present day, and which is something that Jinx had always set out to do, and going back to his website Chicagohoodz in the 1990s. Go on.
Go ahead. Oh, I was sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just wondering, is there going to be another book? Because this book is so in depth. I mean, where does the story go from here?
So we decided to. James actually came up with the idea to do a simple, what was supposed to be a simple book on compliment cards, we as a promotional tool for the history book,
right.
And we thought that might take like a few months to put together.
That's what
I proposed the book. 6 years later, here we are. I proposed the book to Anna Parfrey at Farrell House.
Right.
And he took an interest in it, and it was him that really encouraged us to expand it. And that was not hard to do, given the sheer amount of gang memorabilia that Jinx has collected over the years, from compliment cards to sweaters to all of the photos that he had taken of these different neighborhoods. Going in there and documenting these incredible gang murals. And so it just kind of grew and took on a life of its own. And, it got fairly in depth, but it was basically intended to be kind of like a teaser, but just sort of took on a life of its own, like I said.
Jinx, can I ask you a question? How did you go about collecting all the memorabilia? Like, how did you amass your collection?
Well, that all started when I was a kid. When I was in high school, some neighbors moved in, and there were a lot of people that were moving out of the city because of the escalating violence. And one particular family that I had become friends with, their mother just wanted them to have a better life, well understood.
What year
being
was this? Can
where
you
they
give
come.
us a time frame?
This had to be in 1980.
Okay.
Yeah, and so yeah, their mother made them get rid of all their gang memorabilia. And again, in order for them to start. Lucky me, I just happened to be there when they were getting rid of some of their compliment cards and stuff, and that's what started that collection. And then as I started to venture out into different areas, I had collected a few more, and then over the years, while working on this book in particular, I had met a lot of people and made friends with a lot of people out there, and unfortunately, one of my friends had passed away, and he had given me his collection to hold for him while he was incarcerated, and when he got back out into the streets, unfortunately, he was killed, and that's the nature of that. But I still hold on to those articles.
Can you guys explain how the Chicago gang landscape is multi-ethnic and how the different gangs work together to benefit their criminal enterprises? Because go for it.
Well, Chicago's always been it's always been a very segregated city. With viaducts, railroads, boulevards, creating like mini communities within communities, and the gangs that had come up in these areas reflect that. So it made for easy boundaries between gangs and ethnicity. So historically, Chicago street gangs were turf-based. Of course, there are always criminal street gangs in Chicago forever, but that also depended on the economic stress of that community, which would gangs could see the opportunity in their numbers and power within a economically stressed neighborhood to create little mini criminal enterprises.
Well,
and Chicago is kind of unique in that the first gangs were comprised of people of European descent.
Correct.
And this would have been the early part of the 20th century, just like any city.
Right.
Polish people, Italians, Irish, and they would form what were called social athletic clubs.
Correct.
And these organizations would hold dances. They would engage in sporting activities. At other times, they would partake in various nefarious things like voter intimidation. They became part of the Chicago political machine.
Correct.
The Mayor Daley was a part of one such club called the Hamburg Club. You had Reagan's Colts. But generally, they operated under the banner of Social Athletic Club. So those were the original gangsters of Chicago.
Right.
Then, as the century progressed, you had different waves of migration. You had African Americans coming up from the South. You had Mexicans coming up. You had Puerto Ricans coming in. So this all kind of created this mix. And for some reason, with the greaser, the emergence of the greaser gang culture, that just persisted for some reason. You had white gangs in New York. I'm not too sure. I think you did in L.A., but they died out pretty early on. But for some reason, they really persisted even into the 90s, and to some degree even today.
Yeah, those were more like turf gangs, and they called themselves protecting the neighborhood, and that gave them a cause. But nobody can stop neighborhood change, really.
Well, this is what's interesting. Sorry, I just want to interject here. if you don't mind. What's interesting to me is I've been to Chicago. I've lived there for a while. As both of you said, it's very segregated. So, but what's a trip is, like media wise, when people think of gangs in Chicago, you think Latin Kings, you think Black Keystone Rangers, El Rookins, and you think black gangs. But what's interesting is there's been a long history of white street gangs like Simon City Royals and so on and so forth. So it's like you have these neighborhoods that are segregated, but then on a certain level they come together like to do crimes, like Simon Royals or Down with Folk Nation.
Right.
So it's like it's just interesting how there's segregation, but then there's not segregation when it comes to gang culture, like moving off into like the
Right.
90s. But it's also interesting too how the media makes you believe one thing, like that it's a black or brown problem, but and I wonder if this gives like the white gangs territory to do what they want to do and not be made public as much. You know what I mean?
Well, the whole racial thing kind of has broken down. I think that the heyday of that was really the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
I think
true.
that kind of flared up in the wake of the civil rights movement and Black
Correct.
Power, because it was always about neighborhood,
Yeah.
and that goes back to the name of the book. It was always about who the neighborhood trumped everything. So you would have gangs that were traditionally would be identified as white or Hispanic or black, and if they're from a different race living in that neighborhood, they would just become part of that gang.
Right.
That started to kind of change later on when it got the gangs that were the Taylor Street Jousters are a perfect example. They were comprised of Italians, Mexicans originally. By the 1970s, they were at the forefront of the white power movement. With coalitions like the United Fighting Organization. Yeah, it's a totally different thing. It's like really weird because on the one hand, it was really racist, but
Yeah.
on the other hand, you would have these. It was not.
That's what I'm trying to say. That's it. That's like It's weird. It's like on one hand,
Yeah,
it's
you wanna-
really, huh?
I think one of the first interesting things that stuck out to me was while the old school turf gangs like the Gaylords, the Insane Popes, Satan Disciples and Counts. They might have fought each other on racial terms. They all wore the same sweaters. They all wore the same style of sweaters, I should say. Among the white and Latino gangs, it became a citywide thing. That all these guys, okay, we're gonna choose our colors, and we're gonna wear these sweaters. And
Right.
they all adopted the sweaters with the belts eventually, and so that was a subculture in its own, which was very interesting to me. But as far as the criminal thing goes, again, this if a gang wanted to continue to exist today, they had to adapt to the change, and that's exactly
true.
what the Simon City Royals did. And throughout the 70s and 80s, the prison population was overwhelmingly African American, and the Simon City Royals, because they were fighting other white street gangs, they didn't have as much protection inside the prison walls, so they had to go and meet with the Black Disciples, and made a deal with the Black Disciples to become to trade guns for protection. So that made the Simon City Royals a professional burglary ring. So that's kind of how that came about.
Well, that you're basically
they were kind of pioneers.
Yeah,
Well-
they definitely were the trailblazers.
Yeah, well, I had a question like, why are the Simon City Royals so important to the history of Chicago gangs? And if you could tell us how they went from a white supremacist gang to being a part of the Folks Nation, which is led by an African American Larry Hoover. I mean, you've broken down a little bit, but what that's about. But if you want to speak further, that would be cool.
My theory on that is that probably came about in the either a reformatory or in the prison system.
Right.
Just making connections in there. There's newspaper articles about it was a big meeting that they held on the South Side. So it was like really interesting. You have this North Side white gang that had just coming out of the stone greaser white power era of the early to mid 1970s, going all the way down to the South Side and meeting with with the black disciples to basically work out this arrangement. And that was part of, around the time that they joined Folk Nation.
The folks was just being drawn up inside.
Yeah, so it was almost like something like out of the Warriors or something like that. And then the whole thing got busted up by the cops and all these people got arrested.
Well, I mean, for our listeners to really grasp, everybody listening, Chicago, the South Side is predominantly black. North Side, you have white people. But when I lived there, I met a white dude on the train, and he said he had never been to the South Side. So, like, that's how deep it is. So, for you brothers to say that Simon City Royals made this trip all the way to the South Side, it's deep, because that's some deep shit, because that wouldn't normally happen. Yeah. So this is a historical moment that you're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, it's historical. So
yeah,
it's a whole different
during that period.
That's what.
Especially during that time.
Well, another thing to paint a picture is that the Chicago gangs were based during the 70s in the Black Power movement. I mean, how you had Jeff Fort going to speak in front of Congress or the Senate and actually getting $1 million, and they were tied into like government organizations, and it was about. They were basically had a disguise, basically, is what I wanted to say. But so it's deeper than, for them to deal with white people, it's like, it's saying a lot about the times and everything, I think. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
there was a lot of, sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, can you break down the difference between the folk nation and the people?
Yeah. It's basically, two big giant coalitions or alliances among street gangs. They created this in the prison system and to create a sense of order. So people just wouldn't be just randomly up and killing each other. And when they did this, all the street gangs throughout Chicago had to draw up their literature and had to just become more organized. But between the two coalitions, it also temporarily it created a big peace in Chicago. A lot of gangs that that weren't familiar with other gang neighborhoods were able to go and go meet other gangs that they didn't,
they could leave their neighborhood
going in there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So like within the prison system, it means more that pretty much all but fell apart in the streets. All the gangs fight each other now once again, but there's a lot of reasons for that. But within the prison walls, I think that the folks and people thing still holds true. It means a lot more within the system. When you go as a gang member, when you go into prison, somebody's going to ask you, what do you belong to or who are you? And you could probably say your folks or whatever. And in your little area where you're being housed or where you're being held, the whatever dominant group that represents folks or people, whatever you may be, whatever dominant group or whatever highest ranking member is going to call the shots in that area, and you're going to have to ride under them. Even if your gang is fighting his gang in the street under that particular umbrella, you're still going to have to follow that guy's rules.
Yeah, and it originated in the.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I just wanted to add that the whole thing originated in the late '70s, and then it eventually bled out onto the streets by the early to mid 1980s. I remember being a kid in grammar school and hearing people talk about, okay, now everything is either folks or people, and I was like, people? What does that mean? Like, in my mind, I'm like,
Right.
everybo's a person.
Right.
I didn't understand the terminology.
Right.
Now everything on the streets kind of fell apart, and it's sort of gone back full circle to it, being mostly a prison thing. I would say that there are some organizational differences between the two coalitions. I think that there is a little more organization in the folks, simply because there are more gangs in that alliance. They're a little smaller. The key players in the people were the Latin Kings, the Black P Stones, and the Vice Lords. These are all three very large, very, all these gangs have constitutions and pretty like developed literature. And so there wasn't really a need for them to come up with like a overarching organizational structure for their alliance.
Because they already had one, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was already so ingrained in them. Whereas with the people, the whole concept of literature, which is like, manifesto, codes of conduct, kind of like a mission statement, that came a little bit later in the 1980s. And so you had kind of the development of ruling bodies, or commissions, like the Spanish Growth and Development. They were kind of took a cue from the Gangster Disciples.
That was David Ayala.
With their growth and development, right? So there's a little bit of a difference there, but yeah.
Wow. I mean, one thing that's interesting is that how Chicago's in the middle of America, but it's also, in a way, the epicenter of gang culture, in the sense that one of the strongest blood gangs in Los Angeles is the Black P Stone Rangers, which has its start in Chicago. And so it's almost like you can connect what's going on in LA, you can connect that to what's happening in Chicago, or what started there, I should say. And then in Chicago, it seems like a lot of, although people back in the day migrated from the South up to Chicago, now the gang culture from Chicago has migrated towards the South. Like you have GDs and Simon
everywhere.
City. That's interesting as well,
Yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about that the other day.
What were you saying? I want to hear.
What are they called? The Blackstone Bloods.
The Blood.
T. Rogers, I think his name is.
Well, no, they were just Blackstone Rangers, and they were just Bloods. Like I grew up in L.A. and they were called Blackstone Rangers, but in a way they were just Bloods, and they were like they're a tough blood gang. Like they're well respected. I'm pretty sure they run the neighborhood, which is the Jungles, where that movie Training Days and all that was filmed. So.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's them, and it's just Chicago and LA has a interesting connection over the years, and
yeah, it's so different. Like everything seems very racially oriented in LA. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean now it is, but I mean it's just like I don't know. It's like I guess like it's sort of like the Black Panthers were part of it. You know what I mean? And like that whole era. And that created, once the dismantling of the Black Panthers created the void in Los Angeles for street gangs to emerge. They emerged out of the dissolving of the Black Panthers,
That's pretty cool. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Right. I saw a great documentary, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I saw a great documentary about LA gangs. I can't remember the name of it.
I know which one you're
talked
talking
about
about.
The origins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of them in the movie, they said that they were also like I don't know, like softball teams or just like clubs, like neighborhood clubs and stuff.
Yeah, and they were dealing with white greaser gangs as well. You know, so
Yeah.
Right.
that's what they
But
sort of.
yeah,
Go ahead.
but yeah, going back to what we're talking about, it seemed like those white greaser gangs just died out much faster for some reason.
They
I think they
became the
moved.
wondered why
police
that
force.
is.
I think as neighborhoods changed, everybody moved out, and I think that's
Yeah.
pretty much the what's what for that.
Yeah,
But with like gang culture migrating from region to region, that's really interesting. I mean, the whole folks thing has gone. Like I know people in Atlanta and Florida who talk about that, you know, and I don't even know if they know where that came from.
It's deep, man.
Down there.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Well,
like
like any other chain or corporation or business, everybody's looking to expand, and that's one of the main drives of a street gang is just to get more territory for whatever reason. Well, that also relates to economics as well.
That's what I want to ask you. Like, I almost feel like Chicago gangs were or are still maybe run like corporations or military organizations. Do you see a hierarchy playing out in these gang structures?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, very much so. They're structured like little militaries or little corporations. They're structured the same. Sure. Yeah, I don't know how to expand on that, but
Larry Hoover calls himself the chairman of the board.
Chairman. Yeah.
What do you feel?
You know, I think it.
Go ahead.
He modeled himself on. He modeled him going back to Daley. He modeled himself on Richard Daley, from what I understand. You know, I think he was very influenced by Mike Royko's book. I think it's called Boss, the biography of Daley. I think maybe he read that in prison. And you can see these charts of like all the different, just the chairman, and
right.
Just gets broken down just like any company.
How do you feel
and the military too? You know, like one thing that always fascinated me was like the parallel between like these are almost like paramilitary, or like. I mean, you can think of them in different ways, but like just the fact
generals.
That, like, different ranks, different insignias, or different amounts of bars on your sweaters to signify your rank. But the idea that like these were like little kids creating this stuff, I find that fascinating.
How do you feel
creating something that was that organized?
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you feel like this is like going a different tangent, but how do you feel the destruction of projects like Cabrini Greens and the different projects throughout Chicago, how do you feel that impacted the gang culture in the city?
It just made it spread.
Okay.
It made it spread to new territories. If you I don't know, when you were in Chicago, had you ever been to places like Harvey?
No, I've been to Evanston.
Chicago Heights.
Evanston. I don't remember those places.
Oh, okay, well, yeah. So I remember I used to belong to a volunteer organization that used to try to deter crime, and I remember CHA had bought up a lot of property in one of the north side Chicago neighborhoods, and you know, they as Cabrini Green was getting tore down, as Robert Taylor was being tore down, the Henry Horner homes, all those places were being tore down. The gangs were getting bigger in this particular community, and that's where we just seen the expansion. And when trouble happened out there in that neighborhood between us and them, they would call up for reinforcements from those places, from Cabrini Green or whatever, and before you know it, you'd have 40, 50, 60 guys standing out there in the street that you have to deal with now.
Wow.
So yeah, that's what happens, and you know, again, it's a whole economic issue. These guys are looking to expand. They're looking to make money in different areas. It caused a lot of wars too. Those projects being torn down, and now you've got the families, the residents, you know, the good people, whatever. They have to go to new schools now, and they're, you know, kids from particular neighborhoods are associated with the gang from that particular neighborhood, and there goes your Fanger High School incident. You know, those guys, they had to be bussed over from what was that, the Oakdale Gardens, I think it was, to Fanger High School, which the neighborhood consisted of a rival gang, and that just created all kinds of conflict. And now you got a bunch of kids that they're too scared to go to school, so it kind of messes up their education, and the ball just keeps on getting bigger.
Wow. How this is interesting. How did the Chicago gangs use business cards, and how did the cards get people killed? Like, what's the story of these compliment cards?
Well, compliment cards are just another form of advertising. Kids would pass them around the high school or whatever, and if for that reason alone, but they would also use them as recruitment tools or invitations or invitations to the neighborhoods, not to mention just trying to get girls. But you'd see, you'd have a card printed up, and you'd have the names of the members on the club on it, and they would underline it or circle it and give it to somebody and say, hey, when you come to the neighborhood, just tell them that that I get, that I sent you, So that's pretty much how that was. You want to expand on that, Damon?
Well, I think later on that the cards themselves became much more elaborate, and they became a lot more just used to sort of antagonize other groups. If you look at early cards, they don't really seem to feature as many just like sheer insults that you would see on later cards.
Right.
So over time, it almost became just it may have started as an advertisement. Our theory is that they originated as out of the format of like an invitation to a dance ticket. That's one possibility. Over time, the designs became more ornate. The hand design came into it, and they just became some of them are incredibly intricate.
Yeah.
I think.
But if you look in the book, you'll see some social athletic club cards from the 1920s.
Right.
That resemble the relatively modern or the fairly modern compliment card, all the way to, rather than having slogans written on them, they have songs written on the back. So yeah, they're very similar. I think this is more than likely where the original compliment card may have come from.
Yeah, invitation to dances that were held by the social athletic clubs. And then it sort of went from that to like what to me is almost like these. It's all like gangs like the Gaylords and the Royals. It just became so, or the Latin Kings. It just became so. I mean, that's why I wanted to blow a lot of these cards up in the book, because they're so finely detailed. You know? And
their art.
Just absolutely. But it's like art about insulting other people. Like it's just weird, so yeah, there's so many different types of cards. It's incredible.
It's almost like it's urban hieroglyphics in a way,
Absolutely. I mean, that's the way I thought about.
Yep.
My initial fascination with this came from seeing all the graffiti all over the place. I mean, it was everywhere, and it was so magnetic. Just something about these pitchforks and these crosses, and it just really grabbed me.
How important do you feel graffiti is to Chicago gang culture, and what purpose do you feel it serves?
Well, before the internet, that was your neighborhood newspaper among gang members. You could drive into a neighborhood, you could see who's at war with who. You could see who had died recently by the Rest in Peace graffiti. You could even almost see who they want to kill. I have a picture of a cross on a wall. Well, it's a symbol. It's a gang symbol, but and it says graffiti. When are you going to come out? You know, so they're just, you know, they're waiting on this guy to come out of the house. And, you know, so yeah, that graffiti says a lot more than just scribbles on a wall, you know. And, yeah, I do believe the police were well aware of this and, you know, were well schooled. Gang crimes police officers, tactical officers, they read the graffiti too. They're just the same way.
That's interesting.
We were driving around the other day, and it's just so, Chicago is so different these days. I mean, some of the neighborhoods that I spent time in when I was growing up are just completely, like, you wouldn't even recognize them.
Why? They're
Driving around,
gentrified?
there's gentrified, loss of businesses, but, you know, the worst is when they just tear down a whole block and put these ugly condos up, and, you know, it's just, like, there was a famous Dunkin' Donuts at the corner of Belmont and Clark that stood there for years and years.
That's where the skinheads used to hang.
Yeah, they called it Punkin' Donuts. It was like an epicenter, like punk rock activity. And now it's a bank, and the whole block is just like, I don't even know what these buildings are. But and there's no graffiti, or I mean there is, but
not gang graffiti as much, and not like it used to be.
Yeah, the penalties have become so harsh. Same thing in New York, you know.
For doing graffiti.
So it's not the way it used to be.
Wow. Did you two ever find yourselves in like dangerous situations while researching or putting this book together?
Well, I haven't lived in Chicago for 20 years.
Okay.
You know,
I have
back when I was a kid, sure, but why don't you talk about some of that, James?
Well, yeah, I spent a lot. Well, this is pretty much where I got almost all my information was from driving around Chicago and stopping and talking to people. And I would some of the people became my friends. And well, let's say I have. I've been in a lot of, my car's been bricked a couple times. I've been shot at 3 times. I had a pistol stuck to my head twice.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. What's, Mr. C, let me ask you a question. What do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions of gang members?
That they're just a bunch of young punks out to do harm to the general public, which I suppose they do. But they're
dumb, that they're low intelligent.
Yeah, that's not the case at all.
I think this is a huge misconception.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some of these guys can run multi-million-dollar corporations if they had the opportunity, if they had the chance.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at the organizational ingenuity of somebody like a Larry Hoover or a Jeff Fort, I mean, it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
You know.
Can I ask you a question, Mr. C? Do you think that?
Sure.
Do you think that those two will ever get out of prison?
I don't know. You know, it's funny because I was fascinated by street gangs as a child. I left Chicago in 1998, and I've been living in New York for many, many years. And so what kind of rekindled this interest for me was looking into, in an indirect way, I became very interested in what's going on with solitary confinement in this country, which is just so, I mean, it's just unbelievable, really.
That's like medieval torture.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't understand the point of it. It's not rehabilitation.
I mean, we could.
Right.
So go ahead.
No, with guys like that, I mean, they've been sitting in these, and I mean, not just them, but like there's thousands and thousands of individuals that are just being confined in the most cruel and unusual manner. And so that actually, looking at the guys like that, helped to reignite this interest for me. I don't know, you know, James, do you know what's going on with them?
No, I haven't read any current I don't know. No, I don't really know as far as Larry Hoover and Lord Gino. Those guys, I believe Lord Gino, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it, I think he was up for parole, or at least facing the parole board relatively recently, but I think something happened, and I don't feel safe saying what it was, because I don't remember.
Okay.
As far as Larry Hoover goes, no, I'm in the dark about that. I'm sorry, I really don't know what his current status is as far as that, any kind of relief goes.
Yeah, I couldn't really say, and I wouldn't want anything that to be said that would affect.
Yeah, for sure.
I kind of just want to stay out of that.
Well, with this book, what has creating this book been something that it's become bigger, or it came out better than you ever thought it could come? Because I love it, and I just think it's so in depth and it's awesome. So, I mean, how do you guys feel about it?
Thank you very much.
Yeah. How do you feel about it?
I feel like it's a good weight off my shoulders.
Yeah. It's a lot of work. Anybody who wants to write a book, don't.
It's exhausting.
Is there anything about this book that you want the world to know about that we haven't spoken on before we end? Any chapter, anything?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, I just think that I do think that this is an aspect of Chicago and a form of art that has been very under investigated, and I hope that this book helps to bring more of this particular subculture to light. And I think that if anything, it goes to show you that everyone has an artistic side, and that should be cultivated, even if sometimes that might get put in the wrong direction.
For me, I would just kind of like to. I wanted it to be like as my website. I used to have a website up back 1998 to about 2006 or 7 or something like that. And one thing that I wanted to do was make people aware of this of street gangs, just the existence, and let people know that this is something that needs to be addressed, and turning a blind eye to it. You can cover up all the graffiti you want, but it's not addressing the problem, maybe the allure for kids to join such a self-destructive culture, So, I think this is something that really needs to be addressed. I think people need to pay more attention to it. It is a crisis. So that's kind of where I come from with all of this too.
And also one thing that I wanted to emphasize in the book was that it wasn't always the way it is now. It wasn't always about guns and all this horrible violence. At one point, gunplay was frowned upon.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of try to show people that there is a different way. You can have a club. You can have a group. I think those things are great.
Yep.
But
once upon a time,
other
these
ways
guys
to resolve things.
Yes. Yeah. So. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for making the sacrifices that I know you've had to make to create this book, because it is so in depth. And for what I love about the book is that it's made with passion. It's not made to sensationalize this culture. It's done with taste, intelligence, and I think it's something that's really interesting. And even if you're not into gang culture, it's something that if a person picks up the book, they'll be thoroughly interested in. And You brothers have done a really, really good job, and I appreciate both of you taking the time speaking to our listeners and our readers. You know?
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Cultcast. Stay tuned to the @CultNation IG and cultnation.com for future episodes.